Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized
Systems either change or die.
into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
To wake up, there is one way. Be fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Sophie.
Hi, Ellie.
So there's this squad of clone troopers patrolling a bit of land, and they're surprised to find this, mangled dead body of a battle droid in a ditch along the road. A short distance up, they find a badly wounded clone soldier in a ditch on the other side of the road. The clone is still alive, so his brothers run to him, they cradle his bloodied head, and ask him what happened. He says, "I was walking down this road, holding my rifle, minding my business, when I came across a heavily armed droid guard. I looked him right in the eye and shouted, 'Count Dooku is an unprincipled, corrupt bastard.' The droid looked me right in the eye and shouted back, 'Chancellor Palpatine is an unprincipled, corrupt bastard.' We were standing there shaking hands when the truck hit us."
Oh, that's like a classic. That's just such a soldier joke, though.
Hello and welcome to Daughters of Ferrix, the only Star Wars podcast that has been personally endorsed by George Lucas himself. It's true. Don't look it up.
I would like to state for legal purposes that is misinformation. We do not mean
I would
that.
like to state for legal purposes that George Lucas has asked me to say hello to all our friends and fans, that he loves you and he thinks trans rights are human rights. So,
Do we think that George Lucas thinks trans rights are human rights?
as much as a rich old guy, he's Californian, he comes from the film industry, I expect he would be extremely normal. I don't think George Lucas would call me a slur. I think George Lucas would talk to me like I'm a woman. I don't know if he would have my same opinion on every bit of trans policy or whatever, but he's also a gajillionaire and ancient. So I know he's not ancient, but he's old enough. That's right. I didn't do the intro part. I'm your host, Eleanor Mueller, and with me is my lovely co-host, Sophia Dunstan. Hi, Sophie.
Hi.
Before we begin, let's thank nobody in particular, Meg B, Jake Desjardins, Alex Tawney, Peep the Toad, Anna, and E for supporting us over on Patreon. And an extra special thank you to Emerson Reyes for raising their pledge so high. You all are the stolen power cell that powers this quad laser cannon of a show. If you're interested in early access to the show, episode outtakes, the Daughters of Ferrix Discord server, and our June bonus episode where we talk about the first half or so of The Acolyte and why the hell the Jedi are acting like cops, check us out at patreon.com/Daughters of Ferrix.
Do it.
Sophie, tell me if you heard this one before. The Galactic Empire is the United States of America. Are you familiar?
Oh, I hear that all the time.
Every time some loser tries to get online and pretends that Star Wars is magically apolitical, anyone to the left of Ted Cruz gets in the replies and just dunks on them. The Empire is America. George Lucas said that. The Empire is America. Don't you know that the original trilogy was based on the Vietnam War?
The story, the political backstory was written 30 years ago. It was written during the Vietnam War and in the Richard Nixon era.
It is the single most common comparison that you run into when you're talking about the political implications of the series. It is this square kick in the teeth, the idea that you can divorce the series from its historical roots. It's hyper relevant to Lucas's own understanding of his work.
Yeah, because as we all know, Chancellor/Emperor Palpatine is just Richard Nixon, who George Lucas basically thought was the Antichrist. So
I mean, he wasn't wrong. This comparison is really important. It comes up constantly for a reason. But I think the way that we talk about Vietnam and Star Wars is lacking, really lacking. We talk about the same imagery and comparisons and quotes again and again and again, And despite that, I don't feel like we as a Star Wars audience really understand what any of it means. You know, what does it mean to compare the rebellion to the Vietnamese? What does it mean to say that the original trilogy is a Vietnam film? The United States is obviously an imperial power in all but name, but why is the Galactic Empire comparison so pervasive? Today, let's crack open the parallel at the heart of Star Wars itself, the geopolitical conflict that both forms the inception of the series and also nearly prevented its existence. We're going to talk about the inspiration, trace across familiar quotes, and try to recontextualize what George Lucas has said years and years ago, all in the effort of thinking about history and the events we're talking about in a new way. Before we fulfill any of those lofty goals, we have to lay the groundwork. Sophie, what was the Vietnam War?
The dumbest thing we ever did as a country, but I digress. But no, like you can sort of make an argument for some of the other wars we've had since the Second World War ended. Like probably the first Gulf War, you could be like, well, maybe we should have done that because what's his face was, just invading Kuwait for no reason. Struggling to think of any others, but I'm sure there are some that I could think of given enough time. But like Korea, maybe, I don't know. I think it's good that people in South Korea don't live under Kim Jong-un. Again, I digress. But the Vietnam War, not only because we lost, but also because the way we lost killed a lot of people. So the Vietnam War is maybe the most complicated war that this country has ever been involved in, but I will try to give you a decent rundown. For some background, Indochina, which was an amalgam of the countries that are now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was a French colony from the mid-1860s until the end of the Second World War. The French were not great. I mean, even among colonizers, the French were not great, which is to be expected when you label the colony in question a, quote, colonie d'exploitation.
What?
Yeah. So they had different labels for their colonies, like based on what the colony was for. Like if it was like a colony where we're going to have people move to, that's like a colonie de settlement. And if it's a colony, that we just want to get resources from, it's a colonie d'exploitation, a colony of exploitation.
Well, does what it says on the tin, I guess.
Yeah. The people living under the French colonial government were by no means pacified. Rebellion was frequent and bloody throughout the long decades of French rule, but the hammer didn't really drop until the Second World War when the Empire of Japan occupied Indochina following the French government's surrender to the Nazis. You might know this already, but World War II kind of permanently broke colonialism for a lot of reasons, the most important of which was seeing the former great colonial powers of Europe humbled at the hands of the Nazi regime. If the Germans can best the British and French after repeatedly being humiliated for decades, the train of thought went, why not us? Also, there was kind of this whole United Nations thing now, and the war had allegedly been fought in the name of national self-determination, democratic principles, which made it kind of hard to continue justifying, owning other countries. So, suffice it to say, the 1950s and early 1960s marked the effective end of colonial rule in almost all of the world, sometimes in peaceful transfers, other times in bloody revolt.
Less peaceful transfers.
Less peaceful transfers, if we want to put it in, like, political scientists speak.
Aggressive negotiations.
Aggressive decolonization, maybe? I don't know. To the credit, and I put a question mark after the credit there, of the British, their decolonization process was, relatively speaking, peaceful.
Good job, British? Question mark?
That's why I put a question mark there. Although there were spats, there was no 20-year war of the Brits trying to hang on to India or Egypt or something like that. Like most of the colonies kind of just got out of there. But the French did not do that. They fought tooth and nail for several of their colonies, especially in North Africa. The Algerian War for Independence is quite a famous example of this and was very bad. Indochina was, of course, no exception. After the end of the Second World War, Vietnam was briefly, and by briefly I mean 20 days, so briefly, governed by a provisional government under Ho Chi Minh, which the French promptly overthrew, beginning a brutal 7.5-year guerrilla war with the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese Nationalist Army. Eventually, after a devastating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 Geneva Convention partitioned Vietnam between a socialist-friendly North and a Western-friendly South. Cambodia and Laos also gained independence, setting the stage for the conflict to come.
We're going a direction and I don't like it.
Before we kind of start here, I kind of want to run down of our major characters in this because I'm going to use some acronyms a couple times and I'd like you to know what they mean.
At the beginning of like a script, when you have this person as this character, this person as this character.
That's right. This is the dramatis personae at the beginning of your like Shakespeare play you had to read in the 9th grade.
Precisely.
Character 1 is North Vietnam, also known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which...
I don't know why I expected character 1 to be like a human being.
No, but it was a socialist state.
Many such cases.
I think all such cases.
Yeah.
Maybe Cuba. I don't know. In North Vietnam, surprisingly, I know, governed for the period that we're talking about by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, infamous in America for a very long time, but also probably one of the smartest people to live in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's weird that you never hear people talk about Ho Chi Minh anymore, you know?
You really don't, right? Like, he was kind of the Bin Laden of his day.
Yeah, in a way.
Without, being irredeemably evil. But that's another story. But no, he's a real smart guy, right? He's very educated. He's been to university in like Britain, France, different places in Switzerland and Europe and such. Another one of your countrymen, Ellie. So during and following the Second World War, he comes back to Vietnam and starts leading the Viet Minh, which is, as we previously mentioned, the sort of independence movement. And they eventually, get their way because the French kind of spin off South Vietnam into a puppet state, but the French are really weak now, so it becomes an American puppet state instead of a French puppet state. And
Wait. I feel like you how? Did they just say, you can have this, I guess?
Well, they lose, right? The French lose this war. They don't do well.
Okay.
And as part of the 54 Geneva Conventions, there is established, kind of like there is in Korea, a dividing line between North and South Korea, which are both still claim the entire thing, but only... they can't take it over because there's the whole other one on the other side of the thing. And America supports the South one because, it's anti-communist, ?
What do you mean, ?
Well, I don't think it was particularly anti-communist. I think that was branding to the State Department.
Well, what is anti-communist if not branding?
Although the Viet Minh and eventually the North Vietnamese Communist Party did some sort of land reforms, they were also kind of like, as I mentioned earlier, socialist ? Probably mostly branding to get stuff from the Chinese. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of question marks in this rundown. Hate to be like it's complicated, but it's complicated, man.
It is complicated. I'm going to introduce our two, sort of main combatants here. We have PAVN and ARVN. So the ARVN, which commonly called ARVN, was the South Vietnamese military. It's the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And the PAVN is the People's Army of Vietnam because, get it, socialist state. So we have to call everything people's for some reason.
It's good iconography. Gets the vibe across.
It's like a branding choice for global socialism. And then sort of distinct from PAVN, P-A-V-N, is the NLF, more commonly known as the Viet Cong or simply VC. These guys are sort of part of the People's Army of Vietnam, but also not. They are a distinct organization, but they operated almost entirely under the command and aegis of the People's Army of Vietnam and were supplied almost exclusively by the People's Army of Vietnam. So they were kind of just the People's Army of Vietnam, but they were sort of the guerrilla wing of the North Vietnamese movement to sort of, I guess, reconquer South Vietnam, depending on your perspective. And then there's also, of course, our boys, whomst we stand, the United States military.
Our boys whomst what?
Whomst we stand.
Do we stand? Are they our boys?
So those are kind of our main operational, I guess, guys. There's going to be a couple presidents thrown out here, but I'll try and keep it simple.
Anyone heard of Nixon?
Yeah, you ever heard of Richard Nixon, the most evil person to ever exist?
Well,
I was briefly possessed by the spirit of George Lucas there. Sorry.
He's not in the top 10 least evil people that ever existed.
Well, that's a really hard list to make. Who's on that list?
George Lucas.
George Lucas.
No.
Jesus.
George Lucas owns a controlling share in the Walt Disney Corporation. I have a lot of respect for the guy, but I can't. Yeah.
Gandhi. Well, not Gandhi.
Nope. Guaranteed the least evil people that have ever existed you've probably never heard of, regrettably.
True.
Good people don't get popular. Hello to the audience, by the way.
Showing ourselves as bad people, which, to be clear, we are. Moving on. It's important to note that U.S. meddling in Vietnam began long before the first serious American military presence on the ground. The United States supported...
USA.
We had a stage of what we're currently doing to Israel, where we just gave them money.
Money stage. Many such cases.
The U.S. supported the French war effort in Indochina long before we sent any troops to back up the South. I don't know. That was a really weird move on our part, to be honest with you. And I think it was mostly because the revolutionaries were so explicitly communist. In the 50s and 60s, America was like generally very anti-colonial. One of the reasons that the UN was so anti-colonial is because the Americans were involved. So I don't know. I don't know why we did that.
Make it make sense.
Substantive U.S. military involvement in Vietnam did not begin until 1955, when President Eisenhower deployed what was called the Military Assistance Advisory Group to help train, advise, and lead the fledgling ARVN. The U.S. Navy first got involved in Vietnam during the grandiosely named Operation Passage to Freedom. Yeah.
Passage to Freedom.
Americans love to name stuff like that.
I can't wait until we have the new socialist United States of America, because when we name things, it will be like the People's United Passage to Freedom or something. Like you'll have the populist angle and the freedom angle, and you'll just be like this clash of aesthetics, and it'll be the tackiest thing you've ever seen. Anyway, give it 10 years.
So Passage to Freedom, again, cringe name, moved something like 300,000 people into South Vietnam from North Vietnam, either by foot or on French and U.S. naval vessels. And this was following an earlier migration of something like 2 million, mostly Catholic North Vietnamese. So a lot of people move into South Vietnam. The situation escalated further in 1958 when North Vietnam invaded an occupied part of Laos and began smuggling guns into South Vietnam on the newly minted Ho Chi Minh Trail. The National Liberation Front, a sort of evolution of the Viet Minh, these are the guys we're talking about earlier, this is the Viet Cong, was founded in 1960 as the North resumed hostilities against the South and began an insurgency in South Vietnam.
Well, we're off to a bad start.
You know, I always forget that North Vietnam kind of just invaded Laos and no one remembers that.
Sometimes, if no one's really paying attention, sometimes you can just invade Laos, Sometimes you could just do it.
In my head.
No one's stopping you.
In my head as a child, right? The Ho Chi Minh Trail was oh, Laos was cooperating with Vietnam to help them, get supplies into the South because they were, sort of allegedly a communist state as well. But they weren't, and they just got kind of invaded, and it kind of just sucked for them. So, rip. By this time, our good friend John F. Kennedy was in power in the United States.
Oh my God. Celebrity cameo.
The best president of the U.S., according to all of your grandparents.
Chancellor Lena So herself.
And although he was more focused on a certain crisis near America's worst state, sometimes called the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had time to fuck around in Vietnam as well. ARVN, as it turned out, was massively incompetent, and US leaders saw a need for greater involvement in the ongoing conflict. I cannot describe to you how badly ARVN fumbled the bag. They didn't even, want to fight. They were just, in it for the paycheck, I guess. This is the sort of level of things we saw in kind of the end of the Afghanistan war a few months, or I guess years ago now.
Yeah.
Where the troops would just kind of be you know what? Whatever. ARVN would kind of just do that.
That's
so
embarrassing.
It is a little embarrassing.
Stop making us look bad, ARVN. Come on, we're giving you money. Show a little spirit.
Oh, we gave them so much money. So, Kennedy, as a result of this, massively increased the number of U.S. troops on the ground as, quote, advisors, unquote, in Vietnam. And when I say advisors, these guys...
Freedom advisors.
They were not advisors. ARVN had no, officer corps, good officer corps. So mostly it was U.S. officers were in charge of ARVN, basically. So the number reached more than 17,000 troops in Vietnam by the time he was assassinated. Under his aegis, they also began what was called the Strategic Hamlets Plan, which was a really dumb program of moving rural people to live in fortified villages, unquote, in an attempt to combat the NLF.
Right.
They're here's how we're going to solve this whole insurgency thing and, make sure that villagers aren't getting killed by the NLF. What we're going to do is we're going to move them all into villages, and then we're going to make walls of spiky sticks around the villages, and this will solve the problem. Reader, it did not work. So he started, experimenting with a new strategy. Strategic defoliation. Not good. This would sort of culminate later in the infamous widespread usage of Agent Orange, which I'm sure you are aware.
Yeah.
So Kennedy, kicks the bucket thanks to the CIA in 1963. And
Wait. You almost snuck that right by me.
I was so close.
You almost I almost didn't even catch that. I'm just like, yeah, no, the things that Sophie says are true. She wouldn't lie.
I would not spread disinformation on the internet. And as a result of that, Lyndon B. Johnson, emphasis on the Johnson, becomes president.
Emphasis on the Lyndon. Emphasis on the B.
No, it's
What's the B in Lyndon B. Johnson stand for?
Baines?
If you're right, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Look at you. Political science student.
Yeah, Johnson, though, because he liked to whip out his dick in the Oval Office.
Did he?
He did. He called it Junior.
What? What?
And
How do you know this?
Well, because he would show it to his staff.
What?
And they all wrote memoirs because they're White House staffers.
Sure. Get that bag, I guess.
So, yeah, he would just whip out his dick and
oh my God.
And he would conduct business meetings and things on the toilet. He was a very
What?
interesting man.
What? Okay. I guess we're just gonna have to move on from that and back to the war thing. Okay.
So Johnson, the president who had come to be most associated with the Vietnam War, sort of just immediately massively increases U.S. involvement in the country in the wake of what was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What was the Gulf of Tonkin incident? It might not have happened, but allegedly some North Vietnamese torpedo boats, which are just boats with torpedoes on them, attacked the U.S. destroyer, and then the U.S. destroyer sunk them. And then the same thing happened 3 days later, and then they were like, okay, well, let's bomb the shit out of North Vietnam. And bomb the shit out of North Vietnam they did.
I thought that just squarely did not happen. Is it not clear?
So the first one, the State Department says didn't happen. It was I think August 4th and August 7th, or maybe August 5th and August 7th. I don't remember correctly. I could pull up the thing, but I don't want to. The first one did not happen. The second one might have happened.
Okay.
And we're not sure.
Wait, why aren't we sure?
Because the State Department hasn't said it didn't happen.
Oh, so what I'm hearing, what you're telling me is that it didn't happen.
Is that we made up a reason to bomb the shit out of North Vietnam? Yes, that is correct.
We would never make up a reason to attack people or consider making up a reason to attack people.
No one has ever done this
during
in history.
every conflict. I swear, every United States campaign, there's Operation Red Panda, and it's what if we just pretend that they attacked us so that we can bomb the shit out of them for the next 10 years? And it's we talk about doing that way too much. I don't know, man.
Well, what can I say? Benefits of being global hegemon.
Benefits.
So, sort of as a result of this thing that did not happen, Congress passed a resolution granting the president nearly unlimited power to expand the war in Vietnam.
Interesting.
And you'd best bet he did.
Misa voting for emergency powers to...
That is kind of what happened.
In a much more limited sense.
Yeah, the president didn't get to, have martial law in the United States, but, he did kind of get to do whatever the fuck he wanted in Vietnam. So Operation Rolling Thunder began after a Vietnamese attack on a U.S. base a couple months later. Rolling Thunder, which is, as far as operation names go, this one is quite appropriate.
It's A tier, maybe B tier.
Rolling Thunder would drop more than 1 million tons of ordnance on Vietnam and Laos between 1965 and 1968. And while I was not able to find a source for this claim, I have heard it often said that we dropped more bombs on North Vietnam and Laos than we did, the entirety of World War II in terms of tonnage.
That vibes correctly, but also I have a certain idea of what Vietnam was, so that feels like it could just be a line. It's very pithy.
The thing you have to understand about bombers by the time of Vietnam is they are so enormous compared to what we had in the Second World War. The B-52 can carry I don't know, I want to say 30 tons of bombs at once. And we had hundreds of them at this time. So we could mess some shit up.
Sure.
We only have like 50 of them now, but we can still mess shit up. So like those things are quite large and able to do a lot of, evil.
Yeah. We dropped more bombs over Vietnam than we did the entirety of the American Civil War. Think about it.
I actually think that there was one aerial bombardment in the American Civil War, but don't quote me on this.
Okay.
Somebody got up in a hot air balloon and accidentally drifted over the Confederate lines and started dropping grenades until he got shot.
Oh, he got shot?
Well, I don't think he got shot. I think his balloon got shot.
Okay. So the hero still lives. He's still alive today.
Well, maybe. So, 1965 also saw the first official landing of U.S. ground troops in Vietnam.
Oh.
Notably, there were like 75,000 American troops in the country by this time. But these were the first ones officially there.
Right. The previous ones were advisors. What'd I say? Freedom advisors.
Yeah, they were advising advisors.
The People's Freedom Advisors.
And by the end of the year, there would be more than 200,000 soldiers in the country. By 1969, when U.S. troops began their formal withdrawal from Vietnam, after a policy change under the Nixon administration, there would be more than 500,000 troops in the country, with about 2.7 million total Americans ending up in Vietnam at one point or another.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, a lot of guys, right? U.S. troops would finally leave the country for good in 1973, but not before the war had massively changed and stained Vietnam forever. And I have a list of U.S. atrocities in Vietnam we get to run down now, so this should be exciting.
You have a space in your document that's just
Here, I'll send you a snip of what this looks like. It's very boring because I use Times New Roman, but it's just like
yeah, you really should have done it in Comic Sans. Yes, indeed, U.S. atrocities in Vietnam.
So, as previously mentioned, the U.S. dropped million, (S, close parentheses) of tons of ordnance both on Vietnam, North and South, and on supposedly neutral Laos in an ultimately futile attempt to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Wait. Point of order, maybe points of order. Why did they bomb South Vietnam?
Well,
insurgency?
Yeah. They would just like level forests because they thought that there were NLF guys in there.
How'd the South Vietnamese feel about that?
About how you would expect. But when you have 500,000 Americans in your country, you don't,
Yeah, I do know. Okay, keep going.
To be clear, this did not work. We spent a lot of money bombing stuff that didn't actually really disrupt the North Vietnamese war effort that much because they got really good at repairing the Ho Chi Minh Trail really fast. So, good job, U.S. Air Force. Atrocity number 2. U.S. involvement in the conventional and irregular war in South Vietnam created at least 2 million internal refugees, in addition to those created by destruction in North Vietnam, because pretty much every major city in North Vietnam was just like leveled at one point or another.
The thing about leveling cities is that it has consequences. There are people there.
There are people in there.
That's just kind of how cities are.
Yeah. More than 20 million gallons of, quote, Agent Orange, unquote, which is a potent herbicide, were sprayed throughout the theater of war in an attempt to destroy the jungles that so often sheltered the NLF/Viet Cong.
Wait. Okay, so it's an herbicide, so it just kills the plants, and there aren't any other harmful effects, right?
That's funny, because as it turns out, things that are really good at killing plants are also not super good for other living things.
God damn it. If only we could have seen this coming.
Well, I mean, to be fair, it was the 70s and we were spraying DDT everywhere and like killing every bird in existence. So like maybe we didn't know, but
I'm gonna guess we didn't care.
We didn't care is what actually was the thing.
Yeah.
So Agent Orange is known to cause birth defects and serious illnesses among those exposed to it, and it's estimated that as many as 4 million people were exposed, with 3 million suffering from serious health issues as a result, and over 1 million people are disabled because of Agent Orange.
Oh my god.
Or were, because a lot of them are probably not alive anymore.
Oh my god.
It should be noted that this figure is disputed.
By whom?
The people disputing it is the United States government, so...
I'm sorry. I thought it would be anyone else. I thought it'd be like a third party or just like individual.
I think the argument is that Vietnam was sort of cheesing the numbers for propaganda purposes, but I am sort of inclined to believe that a lot of people were really screwed up by dumping tons of defoliant over a country.
It might have only been 3 million people exposed.
That were exposed. It could be only like, 600,000 people who were permanently disabled.
It's so much much less bad.
A lot of people. So, as a result of this, the bombing, the war, there were a surprisingly large number of military casualties in this war. Not U.S. military casualties, but like ARVN and PAVN military casualties. So as many as 3.5 million people died as a result of the war, including up to 2 million Vietnamese civilians. Most of these deaths, it should be noted, were not like, oh, American bomb hit my house. It was the sort of things that always kill a ton of civilians in wars, namely famine, disease, spoiled water, things like that, But it should be noted that a lot were also the direct result of U.S. military actions. The most infamous of these was the My Lai massacre, in which U.S. ground troops brutally slaughtered around 400 civilians for what amounted to no good reason.
Slaughtered, assaulted, rounded them up, and murdered.
Yeah.
They went because they were like, oh, there might be, I assume they were looking for NLF guys, and they went...
Every civilian is an NLF guy.
Yeah, I wonder where that type of thinking could lead you.
22 soldiers were tried for, doing that. Only one was ever convicted. He only served 3.5 years.
You're joking.
I am not joking. Nixon pardoned him.
God damn. George Lucas is rolling in his grave.
Seemingly progressively more justified in his irrational hatred for Richard Nixon.
Listen, George Lucas might not be literally correct about every facet of Nixon's presidency, but it's not like Nixon isn't the devil.
This is true. There's a reason he's the bad guy in so much of Futurama.
But yeah, if I were writing Star Wars during the Nixon administration, I would look at the president and I would make a gray, wrinkly, evil wizard the bad guy in my space opera. I do get it on like a very human level.
So this massacre was, I don't know, the Vietnam War is kind of the first war in which like a country let the media show the evil shit it was doing. I don't know if that makes sense. Most of the time when you're doing an evil war, you don't let the media be like, wow, you sure are doing an evil war, and then tell your public about that. The US kind of just did that. And so this massacre was kind of excruciatingly documented by the media and is probably like the straw that broke the camel's back as far as US public opinion on the war went.
My Lai was covered up for like a year.
This is true.
I'm going to get to that, but...
And I would say that the cover-up kind of like... I don't know, helped with this being the thing that like pushed most people over the edge.
Oh yeah, I mean, people wouldn't have cared. People would be like, oh, they went after a village, whatever.
They killed a bunch of civilians. These assholes, oh, well, they've arrested them, so this won't be a problem, and then forgotten about it. But because it was covered up.
If the United States didn't act half as suspicious, people wouldn't care.
That's right.
And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think the United States does a lot of things very casually that people should care about, but like some things they're like so precious about. And then when it comes out, people are like, oh my God, you kept this from us. And it's like, you wouldn't have cared if they'd just told you they were killing these civilians in the first place. You wouldn't have given a damn.
Lyndon B. Johnson could have just called them like, oh, what's the slur they had for Vietnamese people? I don't remember.
Nope.
I'm not going to say it.
Not on air.
No, I don't know it anyways. But Lyndon B. Johnson could have just been like, those X's are crap. And then everyone would have been like, yes, sir, Mr. President. Thank you for being extremely racist 4 more years.
Just like all of our other presidents.
So, the end of the story, the U.S. withdraws because Richard Nixon gets elected because everyone hates LBJ because, he did Vietnam. And he starts doing Vietnamization, which is where he, tries to put ARVN in charge of everything. But they didn't ever fix ARVN. So that doesn't go super well. And pretty much as soon as the US leaves, North Vietnam invades again. And this time they win. And there's this kind of mad Afghanistan style scramble. If you guys remember from a couple years ago what was going on in Kabul, this is what's going on in Saigon, is America trying to be okay, well, we have to get all of our people out of here. Otherwise North Vietnam is going to kill them. We have to get all the South Vietnamese people who helped us out of here. Otherwise the North Vietnamese are going to kill them. And then there's also just all these kind of civilians who also want to leave, and so there are people grabbing onto helicopter skids as the last helicopters fly off the building with US Marines. It's not pleasant. And now Vietnam is one country again, and surprisingly we are friends now. So I don't know how that happened. Maybe not surprisingly, because a couple years after this, China invades Vietnam.
Oh, so we're kind of friends by default.
Well, and I don't know. I guess a lot of people in South Vietnam didn't hate the Americans that much, and it's like a generational thing of how much you hate the other guy. So like you'll have US veterans go to Vietnam and like hang out with NLF guys.
They shake hands about, yeah.
They shake hands, they explore the little tunnels that the US soldiers used to have to clear out with knives to try and get the NLF guys out. Like, I don't know. Sometimes this post-war reconciliation stuff that happens is really weird.
I mean, war is inherently pretty bullshit, so it does make a degree of sense to just kind of go, huh, anyway, afterwards.
Yeah.
You get to do that less if you did an atrocity, but
America, cough, cough. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have done all the evil shit. I don't know.
everyone copes differently.
So, the question being, why did we fight this stupid, stupid war? No one liked this war. No one ever liked this war. The only people who ever thought that we were going to win was the Rand Corporation. But we did it anyway. And that's because we had this sort of like domino theory of communism, that if one country follows the communism, then every country will become Soviet Union and etc., etc., etc. And I don't know, man, if I was a Cold Warrior, I was a US Cold Warrior, like, guys like Ho Chi Minh, who are, like, pretty normal and, like, reasonable socialist guys, that's my bud. I don't know, I would have been, like, friends with Tito, friends with Ho Chi Minh, like, you know, trying to get the normal socialists on my side against the weird ones. But
you have to snake it out. Communism is a social contagion. They're teaching it in the schools. Teachers are convincing kids that they might be communists.
If communism was an effective social contagion, it would have taken over. It's not.
It would have.
that-
Yeah, if it were as simple as just touching a communist, you put your hand on a handrail that a communist used earlier in the day. Yeah, we would have a very different world.
As it turns out, like, the world was never going to become majority Soviet-style communist. Sorry, Lyndon B. Johnson and Eisenhower.
I know that's what you were wanting, but it's what you were hoping for.
I know you were guys, like, afraid of that or wanted that so you could use the nukes, but, like,
Yeah.
it was a dumb war. We shouldn't have done it. We did a lot of bad stuff. So,
It seems to me that most of you are poorly informed about the going of the war. Nothing is more confused than to be ordered into a war to die or to be maimed for life without the faintest idea of what's going on.
The Vietnam War sucked. So, let's turn back the clock a little bit and go back to 1967. At this point, George Lucas graduates university and was promptly drafted for the war.
nice.
But during his physical, the doctors made a discovery. George Lucas had diabetes. His grandfather died of the disease, so George was exempt from service. They smacked him on the ass and sent him on his way to work towards a film career. Around the same time, Lucas was friends with another filmmaker, John Milius, who had the wild idea of making a Vietnam film. Milius wanted to volunteer in the conflict, but he didn't get to go because he had asthma. So
these are like the nerds from your like favorite high school TV show who are like, you know, have to stay home and can't play football because they have asthma.
these are the slightly disabled nerds at home talking about the war because they can't go overseas. Milius wrote a script, and Lucas joined the project as its director. They worked together for 4 years to develop this movie, taking it around to different companies, plotting filming locations abroad. At one point, this is true, they were heavily considering going to Vietnam. They wanted to just film it in Vietnam during the war.
Good idea.
That never really panned out. In George's words, I wanted to do it, but could not get it off the ground. Columbia had just turned it down. It had started at Warner, and then it went to Paramount, and it had been just about everywhere in town. I think everybody was just afraid of the Vietnam War, and they were afraid that it was going to cost more than what we thought it was going to cost, and nobody wanted to go near it. He says, I needed a job very badly, so I started to work on Star Wars.
Lucas did not want to make Star Wars. Lucas wanted to make his Vietnam War movie, but because he was unemployed,
He was like, I like sci-fi, you know. Lucas was hot off of this Vietnam War film when he went into the Star Wars script. The first full rough draft was finished in 1974, starring Kane Starkiller and his son Anakin. At some point, they crash land on the jungle planet Yavin, which is the homeworld of the Wookiees, etc., etc. Leia is princess of the planet Aquilai, which the heroes, aligned with the Wookiees, save from an Imperial space station at the climax of the film. In notes made before he tackled this rough draft, scribbled in cursive on a yellow legal pad, Lucas wrote, "Theme. Aqualai is a small, independent country like North Vietnam, threatened by a neighbor or provincial rebellion. Instigated by gangsters aided by the Empire. Fight to get rightful planet back. Half of system has been lost to gangsters. The Empire is like America 10 years from now, after gangsters assassinated the Emperor and were elevated to power in a rigged election. We are at a turning point. Fascism or revolution."
Oh, he really hated Nixon, didn't he?
He really did not like Nixon. You can see what he's getting at.
I like his sort of insinuation that South Vietnam's leaders were gangsters. Because to be clear, they definitely were.
Yes.
Yeah, these were not like good guys. So I do rather like that theme.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the setting here, this is Vietnam shit. There's a little bit of pushing, massaging some points. The Empire is like America 10 years from now.
And also like a certain perspective on Vietnam as well.
And we will get to that perspective. But yeah, it's very much a part of this first draft. And the visual settings of the final films clearly carry this inspiration forward. Yavin 4, the base of the rebels, is a lush jungle world. Endor is staggeringly green, with unending forests that the rebellion fights out of, while dressed in camouflage, in stark contrast to the prim put-together Imperial installation. The Empire is as superpowered as the regime could be. A military force with a giant space station that evokes the United States world-ending nuclear arsenal. An arsenal that the United States did consider moving into South Vietnam to prepare for potential use in the conflict at short notice.
The amount in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s that like crazy generals and stuff would just be like, hey, we should nuke them. And everyone else would be like, what are you talking about? You freaking idiot. Do you want to end the world?
We always did this.
Like, I don't know if like we ever considered like nuking Iraq or whatever, but if in 20 years it comes out that like Mattis was like, hey, can we nuke Baghdad? It would not surprise me.
Surely. Tepid credit to the United States that, generally speaking, that didn't go much further. But it is insane that, like, every conflict, there's Project Red Panda. The effects director of photography on Empire Strikes Back explained that the Imperial walkers on Hoth, quoting from the book The Making of Star Wars, began as an analogy to the kind of unwieldy armament and tactics that the US military forces had used in the jungles of Vietnam, with the Empire using inappropriate equipment for its attack on the ice planet base.
Yeah, I don't know. The US has somehow, despite having exclusively fought this type of war for a really long time now, never really gotten good at counterinsurgency. And, there's certainly like this idea in military strategy that effective counterinsurgency isn't actually possible.
Do you think that's true?
I'm interested by the concept because when you think about the direction that weaponry has been evolving in sort of recent years, which is towards very cheap, very powerful weapons that can destroy like highly expensive and powerful pieces of equipment, right? Like those things that we keep giving to the Ukrainians, the Javelin things, that's a pretty cheap piece of kit. It's basically just an RPG with a computer in it. And they have
That's funny because I have a computer with an RPG in it. Sorry.
And they have basically, with that and with like the equivalent of drones you buy at Walmart with a bomb strapped to it, destroyed the entire Russian tank fleet, which was like by far the largest in the world. Like they had something like 60,000 tanks just kind of sitting around left over from the Cold War. And basically all of those are gone now. So can you fight, a symmetrical war anymore? I don't know.
In the original trilogy, the rebels are scrappy as hell. Their fighters are banged up and obviously less of a threat than the huge Imperial vehicles. We use the term asymmetrical warfare a lot around the original trilogy, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of key to it. The Empire is a big and supposedly competent organization, but the rebels are determined and knowledgeable, and they don't overextend their forces. Key to the use of starfighters is the idea that you get in and get out of there as fast as you can, focusing less on gaining territory than you would in a traditional military setting. The majority of engagements in Vietnam were started by America's opponents. The goal was attrition, the steady damage of United States forces and equipment.
Because the thing is, North Vietnam knew that it could not win a conventional engagement against the United States. There is not probably a country on the planet even today that can be confident of a win of a symmetrical engagement against the United States, right? There's just too much money and too much firepower there. But if you can find places of weakness and apply as much force as you can there as quickly as possible and then get the hell out, then you have a shot, right? Like there were a lot of these kind of like offensives that would just be very limited, very short term. It would not be like what you would call a general offensive, which is trying to sort of push back the whole line, but in a specific area to damage US, equipment, interests, and troops, and then getting out of there. And this just happened over and over and over again. And even though, every time the North Vietnamese, the NLF, Viet Cong, whatever, are losing way, 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 way more than like the US and ARVN are, it does a lot more damage to US morale, and that's what ultimately wins the war.
I mean, yeah, the Vietnam War felt so anomalous in part because everyone was like, yeah, the US are those big guys with all the expensive stuff. And it's true that they are the big guys with the expensive stuff.
And if you try to fight the big guys with the expensive stuff on the terms of the big guys with the expensive stuff, you will lose very hard. Look at Desert Storm, where the Iraqi military tried to fight the big guys with the expensive stuff like they were big guys with expensive stuff and proceeded to get curb stomped in 3 days, right?
Accurately assess your own capabilities.
Accurately assess your own capabilities and work based on that.
So that early draft of Star Wars had the Wookiees as a people native to Yavin, who became the backbone of the anti-Imperial force. The asymmetric warfare angle is dialed up even further in Return of the Jedi. When it's not sleek, scary spaceships against hunks of junk, it's Imperial stormtroopers against an indigenous tribe of Ewoks and being crushed by carefully maintained traps made to take advantage of the jungle's unique terrain. This is like core to like certain cultural ideas about what the NLF looked like.
I mean, you see those like kind of secret tunnel networks from the Vietnam War where the NLF would hide in and like, I don't know, kind of Ewok vibes. There were like booby traps with spike pits in there. So
this is all there. This is present in the text. And some people at the time did genuinely notice Star Wars having clear analogies to Vietnam. But a lot more did not. In a review from the Washington Post, Star Wars is cited as having helped to close the wounds of the Vietnam War, that it tapped into inspirational depths that transcend political allegiance. It reflected politically uncomplicated yearnings to be in the right, to fight on the side of justice against tyranny. Why? Why did so many miss the message? George Lucas made Star Wars with the same concepts he was going to use in that war movie. Shouldn't it be obvious? Well, I don't know. George Lucas wasn't just inspired by Vietnam. He also referenced Flash Gordon, Kurosawa, the Dam Busters, the Searchers. The uncountable influences that Star Wars is predicated upon is one of the worst-kept secrets in genre film history. And obviously, as we've talked about on this show, the Galactic Empire draws visual information from the Nazis, a choice which often dominates the public's understanding of the imperial regime.
When you have all that triumph of the will nonsense going on, it's very difficult to associate that with your own guys.
The ways in which people... I'll get there. In the history and politics of Star Wars, Chris Kempshall notes that what Lucas took from the Vietnam War was the morality and necessity of the conflict. Star Wars was his way of working through his feelings about Vietnam from the perspective of an American citizen who did not participate in the war. And you can see that, the moral angle, when you look at what George says when he brings up the historical context. The original draft of Star Wars was written during the Vietnam War, where a small group of ill-equipped people overcame a mighty power. It was not a new idea. Attila the Hun had overrun the Roman Empire. The American colonies had been able to defeat the British Empire. So the main theme of the film was that the Imperial Empire would be overrun by humanity in the form of these cute little teddy bears. Chris Kempshall points out that in thinking of the war this way, it divorces the Vietnamese from their political realities. The Vietnam War wasn't as simple as apolitical hayseed farmers resisting tyranny. They operated under the direction of the Northern Vietnamese political establishment. Many were fighting for an entirely new social order. Quoting the history and politics of Star Wars, Lucas himself was clear in his own mind that the Vietnam War was a moral conflict and needed to be understood as such. However, by framing it along these lines, he removed much of the political agency from the Viet Cong, and as a result, stripped it from the Rebel Alliance as well.
The thing about the Vietnam War, right, and, most wars in general, I would say, there are no good guys. The NLF also did a lot of kind of heinous shit to South Vietnamese civilians. As we mentioned earlier, they did kind of just invade Laos. So that is sort of morally decomplicating, deproblematizing one side of the war in the way that's kind of like orientalizing almost. Like,
yeah, it's dehumanizing, right?
They have no agency. They aren't people. They're just kind of North Vietnam is an idea, basically, is what George Lucas is saying here. Like, in the same way that for a certain subset of online right-wingers, the 1950s is an idea.
It's about symbols of political and moral meaning. Unavoidably, a lot of history and politics is. Like, as much as we like to say, you know, we want to make sure that we're not just doing politics as aesthetics, there are ways in which all of politics is aesthetics. If you are politically bankrupt for the sake of aesthetics, that often actually just kind of turns into fascism. That's kind of what fascism is. So with this framing, it might be wrong to say that Star Wars is about Vietnam. It's not portraying the war, per se. Star Wars references symbols meant to evoke certain ideas of the Vietnam War, ideas that Lucas wasn't the only person to hold dear at the time. In order to understand those ideas, we have to talk about media, public myths, and the optics of war itself. In the 20th century, war went worldwide. The sheer scale of the First World War is pretty hard to comprehend, but it's characterized by as many as 20 million deaths. New innovations in technology like machine guns, grenades, and massive artillery weapons made the war especially destructive, and those fighting especially vulnerable. If you look up photos from World War I, you'll see black and white shots of men walking through trenches, wading through mud with smoke and barbed wire on the horizon. The imagery of the war is filled with decimated tree lines, boardwalks over wastelands strewn with the corpses of men barely old enough to grow facial hair. There's a recording from 1916 of British soldier Edward Dwyer singing a song to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, with the lyrics, "We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here." This was a common refrain from the soldiers. Many didn't know why they were fighting, why the powerful were sentencing these boys to die at the hands of others just as powerless. It must have felt especially meaningless. Edward Dwyer was killed fighting in Guillemont, France, a month after that recording.
Hello, 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 hello.
The First World War is referred to continually in terms of its tragedy, its cost, its futility, the harm it did to the international psyche. That's not the whole story, right? I'm not saying World War I was actually good. I'm saying that it's interesting that we conceive of it as uniquely bad. Wars are always terrible for those stuck participating in them. People die. Young men are chewed up and spit out for the benefit of their nation fucking constantly. Modern weaponry wasn't as brand new to that war as we say it is. You could see a lot of destruction in the American Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War. The First World War was really big, but that size meant that there was a lot of variety in the experience of people who served in it. Not everyone was a British soldier on the Western Front. Not everyone was infantry. Huge numbers served in logistics, communication, artillery. It wasn't all squalor and mud. Dan Todman, in his book The Great War Myth and Memory, argues that the most common experience among soldiers, even on the war front, wasn't terror, it was boredom. Soldiers spent a tremendous amount of time just waiting. Armies as large as the ones that you see in World War I are typically put together very, very quickly and don't tend to be particularly efficient. Sheer bureaucracy was an all too common experience for those caught up in it. Hell, we can also think of "we're here because we're here" as this deeply silly sentiment, highlighting the fact that the war is an endless waste of time. Quoting from Dan Todman, whilst many of the men would have seen the impacts of the war on a daily basis and lost friends and relatives to it, their experience of the war was far removed from the popular conception of trenches and relentless mud and guts. Their story has been all but lost by the public and historians, and only recently has it become a subject of academic study. When it comes to meaning-making around World War I, the monopoly is held by its tragedy. Historical accounts are shared with that in mind. Interviews were conducted with an eye towards suffering. Films about the conflict regurgitate trench imagery and the misery thereof. There are a lot of reasons we probably think of it this way. For one, unlike a lot of similar conflicts in recent history at the time, World War I was not waged by professional armies, but by soldiers that were drawn from the civilian population, including the well-educated, well-connected men who wrote about what they saw in the war for decades. There's also the narrative aspect. Accounts of the war that got popular were the ones that told the story that their audiences wanted to hear. which often means that the story has to end with combat. This is the exciting shit. This sets apart the civilian from the military. But when you're stuck focusing on those sorts of stories, of course you're going to be thinking about the war in terms of calamity. It's gore. The most popular contemporary media about the war was the 1918 documentary The Battle of the Somme, which features dramatic shots of soldiers running past the camera above the trenches or huddled down inside while sheltering from enemy artillery. But a lot of these shots were actually staged. They were shot at a training school behind lines, filmed for the sake of drama, for a good movie, to show the viewing public a representation of the war they already had a certain idea of. The Second World War was also really bad. There were a lot of conflicts and conditions that were at least as terrible as its predecessor. Injuries inflicted by modern technology, obviously. But World War II gets a different legend, that of this difficult victory against a grand evil. It sucked, and lots of bad things happened, but fighting the Nazis was portrayed as just and noble, so the really shitty parts tend to get more of a pass. Even though, by most metrics, more people died. World War II isn't about the horror or the trauma of its soldiers. It's about the triumph. The Great War, Myth and Memory, explains that myths simplify, reducing the complex events of the past to an easily understood set of symbols. Their social function is to ease communication. Rather than explain exactly what occurred each time we refer to a huge historical event like the Great War, we develop myths which sum up what is commonly supposed to have happened, and which we can rely on others' understanding. Wars aren't just events. They became mythologized, and as a product of that myth, they become a bedrock for culture. So, what was the myth of the Vietnam War?
Well, I think the main one was that helicopters are cool and not just things that kill you.
People do be liking helicopters. No, that it sucked. I mean, not just that it sucked, right? That's a particular myth about the Vietnam War.
I think one of the myths could be that it was sort of like a uniquely unfair war for like American youth, right?
Right. Well, we're about to get into that. So, there are different lines about the Vietnam War. This is history in living memory. In a lot of ways, it hasn't metastasized into a more consistent myth. In the beginning, support from the general public was pretty much a given. The American people didn't have a lot of reason to distrust their government. World War II was this symbol that you can fight a just war. If you're sending your kids off, there's probably a reason for it. But a lot of young people didn't feel the same. The first notable student protest against American influence in Vietnam was in 1963 and continued through the following years, including teach-ins and demonstrations. The movement grew in 1965 when the selective service system changed their draft policy. So full-time college and graduate students could previously defer being drafted as long as they were in school. But in 66, any student with poor enough academic performance would no longer be eligible for deferment. They'd have to ship off to war.
Okay, I know that's terrible and it probably disadvantaged minority students, but it is quite funny, like, to think of professors being like, hey, better do well in my fucking class or I'll send you to Vietnam.
Oh no, it's hilarious. It's deeply silly to even think about. Like, it sounds made up because it sounds like something your dad would tell you. Like, your dad would be like, if you don't get an A in class, I'll send you to Vietnam.
Back in my day, if you didn't get good grades in college, they would send you to Vietnam where you'd have to walk uphill both ways through the snow to kill the Viet Cong.
Yeah. Understandably, students already didn't like the draft. Students fucking hated this. University of Wisconsin students occupied campus buildings. Cornell University students organized movements to burn draft cards. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was leaving Harvard College after an off-the-record lunch as a part of a Kennedy Institute program, it's not important, his car was surrounded and he was mobbed. They hoisted him up onto the hood of his convertible and made him answer questions from angry students.
I mean, I think he got off pretty light. Like, they could have, like, egged him.
He had it so easy.
And all they did was make him answer questions. Like, come on, man.
Anyway.
That's so college student of them, being like, you know, we've got this guy. Oh, what are we gonna do? He better get up on stage. He's gotta answer our questions.
I cannot emphasize enough how these protests, most of them were not that bad by any metric. So these protests naturally turned to the nature of the war. The US presence in Vietnam in the first place, the treatment of Vietnamese civilians, the technological domination of the US over their opponents. It didn't look good. People knew it didn't look good. When Dow Chemical Company, official supplier of napalm to the US government, was attempting to recruit on campus, students responded appropriately. During one such response in October 1967, a peaceful protest blocking Dow interviews at the University of Wisconsin turned bloody when Madison City police officers used force to remove students from the building. They used riot batons and tear gas on the crowd, even attacking students that weren't part of the protest in the first place. Quoting Hank Flax, a student there that day, "As students, we had no weapons other than our voices and bodies to indicate our opposition to the war." And obviously, when you have cops fucking with student protesters that are disruptive, but not harmful, those students and students from other schools are going to remember that as like uniquely unjust. Of course they will.
Yeah. It's not uniquely unjust. I think we should be clear about that. Like, the thing about American cops is they really love to break up a protest. They've been doing it for a really long time.
American cops love to beat people up.
Yeah.
But it feels especially poignant when you're like, this bad thing is happening. And the cops are like, okay, well, we're going to bash a few heads in. And the cops do look the other way in certain cases.
Yeah, they really do. And I know it's not funny, but I'm also going to draw attention to the line, even attacking students that weren't part of the protest in the first place. Like,
yes.
Imagine being like Joe Bob McGee, just like, walking around campus and the cops just like, oh, I'm going to beat the shit out of you.
There's an account I read, which, if I remember it correctly, someone, like, the cops were already doing their shit. Someone walked out of a building because they were heading to class, and a cop threw them to the ground, and they dropped their books, and I think they got clubbed in the back of the head. I hope I have that right.
Nice.
No, not nice. Bad.
I was said in a sarcastic voice.
So, students were mad. Students were understandably mad. Students were justifiably mad. But these protests were not popular. Most Americans saw them as unpatriotic, as the petulant action of ungrateful youth, because that's how we look at students. Notwithstanding, ultimately, the war wasn't popular either. In 1965, when asked if sending troops to fight in Vietnam was a mistake, 60% of Americans said no, not a mistake. 8 years later, those numbers had flipped. 60% said yes, this was a mistake. And, why? Partially, it was because a lot of American soldiers were dying. At first, it's easy to hand-wave casualties and say it's a part of war, but that war went on, and the United States' political objectives were fairly opaque. Why are we even over there in the first place again? For what purpose are young men dying exactly?
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Not that many Americans died in Vietnam. We lose more people yearly to traffic accidents, but the war felt bad. It did not pass the vibe check. It started to become clear that military leadership was floundering. Progress in Vietnam was minimal, there was no end in sight, and they were getting their asses handed to them. America was going to lose. And with this impending loss came the fresh understanding that, to quote the New York Times, the Johnson administration had systematically lied, not only to the public, but also to Congress.
Yeah, it's good that Johnson died before the war ended, because otherwise, man, I don't think Donald Trump would have been the first president to be convicted of something, because man started a whole war off of something that probably didn't happen. We still feel the psychic damage of everyone knowing that that happened now, which is why we have things like 9/11 truthers and bullshit like that, because everyone is sort of lost trust in the government as a result of the Vietnam War because of how, evil they were for no reason.
Nixon entered office in 1969.
Nice.
After campaigning to end the Vietnam draft. People didn't like the draft, so this was widely seen as a positive thing. And eventually, the idea was that he would put an end to the war. But it didn't seem to be as much of a priority for Nixon as people wanted it to be. The systematic lies didn't end. Word got out that the US military had expanded operations in Vietnam without telling Congress.
Very bad. Very bad. Go on.
And the public learned about the My Lai massacre a year after it was covered up. Which makes it seem worse. It was an atrocity no matter what. But we said it earlier, the American public would have shrugged. Probably. The students wouldn't have, but your mom and dad in Ohio? Absolutely. They would have been like, that's the cost of war. In 1970, President Nixon went around Congress and announced that the Vietnam War would extend into the neutral Cambodia. which was bad. And the students thought this was bad. As many as 2,000 people at Kent State University organized a demonstration in response, to which the National Guard was called. Protesters ignored orders to disperse, for which they were tear gassed. The National Guard continued to agitate the students, a few dozen of which responded by throwing rocks. Without verbal warning, the National Guardsmen opened fire into the crowd. Nine people were wounded. 4 students were killed. Nixon had called anti-war students bums 3 days earlier. He insisted, wrongly, that the protests were the work of outside agitators. Again, most Americans did not like the protests. They blamed the students for getting shot.
Yeah, because I keep saying the American electorate is evil and likes bad things.
Sure. This is not news. But this picture of violence, of state barbarity, of military incompetence formed the picture of the Vietnam War that's commonly understood today. The post-war aftermath didn't do much to help. War is always traumatic, but at least you can usually enjoy your own homecoming. But Vietnam veterans felt scorned by their peers for the unpopularity of the war. People didn't think they should be over there in the first place by the time they came back. And they were spurned by their country, too. To say GI benefits were lacking would be an understatement. VA healthcare and educational benefit requests were sometimes just wholesale rejected, and it was hard as shit to find a job. This is a far cry from the hero's welcome that many of their fathers received when they returned home from World War II. With parades, compensation, healthcare, vocational rehabilitation, the contrast was clear. It was the mid-70s. And from the perspective of many, the United States looked terrible. The government lied, it killed foreign civilians, it treated soldiers as expendable, that's a bad one, it shot dissenters, and all for basically nothing. Vietnam was, at best, a waste of time. At worst, it was sheer atrocity. It is understood as the first war in history that the United States squarely lost. Today, Vietnam is thought of kind of like the First World War. A miserable, incompetent struggle, a loss of innocence for its soldiers, pointless objectives. The biggest difference is that we often think of the people who participated in the Vietnam War much less charitably, and that adds to this idea of, like, governmental failure. And for the record, this is right when George Lucas was going to school. He probably started in film school at the University of Southern California around 1963 and graduated in 67. It's not clear exactly to what degree USC students engaged in demonstrations, but there are contemporary articles in the student newspaper about anti-war teach-ins, anxieties about draft vulnerability, and a 1965 snippet from an English major highlighting the historical precedent for student protest. This was the boiling water in which Lucas swam. Lucas himself put the American relationship to the Vietnam War this way. To not make a decision is a decision. It happens in all countries when a certain force, which everyone thinks is wrong, begins to take over and nobody stands up against it, or the people who stand up against it can't rally enough support. What usually happens is a small minority stand up against it, and the major portion are a lot of indifferent people who aren't doing anything one way or the other, and by not accepting the responsibility, those people eventually have to confront the issue in a more painful way. In retrospect, we should talk about the ways in which Lucas ignores the political reality of the conflict. At times, this simplified view of the war and the Northern Vietnamese ventures into the territory of the noble savage trope, where members of a supposedly primitive society are inherently capable, strong, and morally just, in contrast to typically white people. The people reduced to the role of noble savage are denied personhood and political nuance, often having their achievements and their mistakes diminished in order to fit that simple moral narrative. This way of looking at non-white people is built upon racist assumptions about who deserves and is capable of complexity.
Socialist, and I put that in quotes again, Vietnam is a very complex country to think about on the world stage because they had their share of, sort of 20th century dictatorship stuff, if you know what I mean, where they would, imprison people for political dissidents and suppress religious minorities, yada, yada, yada. And as we discussed, they did invade Laos for no reason. But also, when the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia and did much worse things there than anything that happened under the Vietnamese government. Something like, I think it was, half of the Cambodian population just died. America wasn't going to do stuff in East Asia anymore. And so Vietnam liberated Cambodia from a political faction that they had helped to support and set up in the first place. So I don't know, it's all so complicated, and we, in every conflict, but especially those videos involving people of non-white ancestry really love to sort of decomplexify everything into like, one was the good guy, one was the bad guy, etc., etc., etc. But the reality is, everyone is complicated, everyone does evil things, everyone does good things. I don't know.
When sometimes people do more evil things than other people. But when you create a myth out of something, you can lose a lot. Again, the ease of communication is a big part of it. We simplify ideas to often very moral roots for the sake of communicating their value or their lack of value. That's not always incorrect, but it is reductive. And it doesn't get you to the clearest understanding of historical events, geopolitics, etc., etc. And that doesn't mean that there is never a place for moralizing, right? Because all of this is said, of course, George Lucas viewed the Vietnam War as a moral conflict. He was a student in the mid-60s. Like, he started the script the year the US pulled out of Vietnam. From George Lucas's perspective, it made a lot of sense to be worried about the US government levying their power in increasingly ghoulish ways overseas. He knew that food sources for millions were destroyed. He knew that people voted into office were responsible. He knew that soldiers endorsed by the country he felt so loyal to assaulted and murdered civilians with the excuse of stamping out insurgents, never bothering to distinguish between vulnerable children and the fighters that the military force was claiming to extinguish. Let's talk about Palestine. In the last 8 months, at least 37,000 people have been killed in Gaza, with 2 million displaced in a sustained Israeli campaign that has been denounced by world organizations as a genocide, which, seems to be the intent. Before the October ground invasion, Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant referred to Palestinians in Gaza as human animals. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich called for total destruction. Retired IDF Major General Giora Islands said that Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist, that humanitarian crisis was a necessary means. In a since-deleted Twitter post about a week ago as of recording, Israel shared a message that included the words, "There are no innocent civilians there," endorsing the fiction that to be Palestinian is to be inherently insurgent. For the record, a little under half of the casualties thus far have been children, so probably not secret Hamas combatants. This logic, this way of seeing an entire ethno-national group, is only permissible if you are comfortable with treating Palestinian lives as expendable. And
oh, yay, we helped.
Some people are cool with this.
Some people are cool with this. Your tax dollars paying for religious-based genocide.
Yeah, so for decades, the United States has been buddy-buddy with Israel. Let's just say that. They are the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign aid. Since 1999, the U.S. government has signed commitments wherein they've given, on average, at least $3 billion annually in military aid. The U.S. has run point for Israel quite a bit on the international stage. It's promoted good relations between Israel and its neighbors, and has used its veto power in the United Nations Security Council 42 separate times against resolutions condemning Israel. This is like half of the times the United States has done this for anything at all.
Yeah, well, what can I say? The pro-genocide voters are a large bloc.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are probably not from the sort of insane background that I am from.
Some of our listeners are.
Maybe some of y'all are. Maybe, I don't know. There's this sort of idea in what you might call evangelical Christianity in this country, which has taken root, because a lot of these people are what you would call biblical literalists or fundamentalists, which is...
or losers.
Well, yes, but they take scripture and like every word must be true, every word is literally true. So like, 6,000 year creation, all that sort of stuff. But also, they think that God has given Israel explicit sort of command to exterminate Palestine. Because there is, in the book of Exodus and on through Joshua and even up into kind of the period of the Kings, right? This sort of idea in scripture that like, you gotta kill off all the Palestinians because, they're inherently evil and worship evil gods and stuff. And most biblical scholars, are of the opinion that that is like, propaganda creeping into sacred texts, right?
But that could never happen.
Like these guys being like, oh, we got to kill off all these guys. And God told us to, by the way. These guys do not think that. They think that it's true. And they've come up with a very interesting theory for that, which is that all Palestinians and in some cases Arabs are descended from demons.
Not a very original one.
No, it's not, but it is kind of interesting because in the book of Genesis, before Noah gets on the ark, there's this sort of reference to people having sex with demons as one of the reasons that God floods the world, right? And so the idea of this is that their descendants became Palestinians.
Oh my God.
And God was trying to wipe out, these descendants of humans plus demons. And
doesn't this mean that the Noah shit happened for nothing? Isn't that kind of
yes.
Aren't they kind of dunking on God?
Well,
God can't flood the world properly.
It didn't work. Well, it didn't work as well as God hoped it would. And so now we have to kill them all out the old-fashioned way instead of flooding the world again because God promised he wouldn't do that again. And so therefore we have to genocide all Palestinians.
So we have to do it.
Yeah. And so this is, when you look at evangelicals or people of that sort of political inclination who are like fine with Israel doing evil shit and fine with their tax dollars.
Often deeply anti-Semitic. Evangelicals.
Yes, who are fine with Israel doing evil shit. That's why, because they think they're descended from demons and God has given Israel a mandate to kill them all. But this is kind of sort of irrelevant. But this is also really why you don't want Trump to get elected into this situation.
Oh, no.
Because these people will pressure him to give them more weapons as fast as possible to kill these people off because, as we mentioned, they are descended from demons. So
don't say it. Don't say it that way. Don't say it like it's true.
Well, they're not. I mean, clearly not. Like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And the thing is that a lot of, right-wing Israelis also hold this kind of view. So I don't know why you would believe that, but I guess it's easier for some people than recognizing that, like, scripture was written by people. I don't know, man.
I mean, a lot easier to kill an obscene number of people.
To kill an entire ethnic group, yes.
Yeah, than to just kind of change your tune on the Bible a little bit.
Because if one word is not literally true, because there's no such thing, there's no allegory in the Bible.
Yeah, there aren't stories. I don't know. As someone who has some experience with changing her tune on the Bible, it's not as hard as people make it sound. So, Israel has always been a colonialist project. They've been forcing Palestinians into worse and worse conditions for the better part of a century. They already didn't deserve our military aid. But obviously things have reached a bit of a fever pitch, and the United States of America is still in it with them. In October of 2023, Joe Biden sent $14.3 billion in emergency military aid to Israel. He parroted debunked Israeli war propaganda to the press. Twice in December, he bypassed Congress to approve of emergency weapons sales to Israel. Quoting an article in Time, his statements of concern over Palestinian deaths have been belated and unemotional, creating a vivid contrast with his rousing declarations that he, as America's leader, will keep faith with Israel. Which is not a great look. It's said that Vietnam was the first televised war. Film from Vietnam was flown to Japan for development before final delivery to the US. But most news programs about the war weren't actually footage fresh from the battlefield. They were anchormen reporting on wired dispatches. I really like the idea that the television angle was like such a big part about the Vietnam War, but I kind of feel like it's a little bit overstated how much it changed support, right?
Oh, it's way overstated because television was ubiquitous by the time that the Vietnam War was happening, but it was not nearly as ubiquitous as it is now. Like, we're still in the 3 channels era back then, so there's only going to be so much coverage.
Right. Your friend's kid dying is still a bad look. It's not all because of TV. But what TV did do was keep, like, imagery of Vietnam ever present. Television puts the war in people's homes in a way that radio never really did. And if you already don't feel great about the war, you might be more radicalized against it. You can't look away from the ugly truth. It's there. It's reality. It's a harm that your taxes are paying for. Palestinians, for their part, have kept the truth of their living conditions alive. Journalists and sometimes normal-ass people have spent this horrifying campaign. They're doing what we all do. They're posting. They've been sharing images, videos, written accounts of the suffering of their people, of the loss of their family members, events running entirely counter to IDF talking points.
What I will say is quite remarkable about this is how resilient the telecommunications network has been, given how heavy a bombardment Gaza has sustained. Like, the fact that people are still able to get stuff out is quite a testament to ingenuity on their part, because everything has been bombed to shit in Gaza at this point. So
I'm sure at this point people know where to go for like reception and shit, which is grim.
I mean, if you go close enough to the border fence, you can probably pick up one from like Egypt or Israel or something, which is
right.
Grim.
Get onto an Israeli person's Wi-Fi.
Yeah, you might actually be able to.
Guess whatever horrible racial slur from some right winger on the border. Yeah. Media and government narratives covering for Israeli violence have been somewhat ground away by the sheer number of Palestinians documenting the devastation of their lives, the sound of bombs outside their homes, the places they've gone to for refuge. I think most people listening to this have seen photos of parents carrying dismembered remains of their children, or accounts of aid workers delivering food to starving children before they're cut down by machine gun fire.
Or the IDF bombing piers built to, bring in supplies.
Kind of for the sake of it. It all lays bare the cruelty at the center of this supposed war. And lots of people do not care about that media, about the images, about the footage, about the fact of the matter, about the people getting hurt. Lots of people don't see it. A lot of students see it. In April of this year, students around the country occupied campus buildings, formed encampments, and rallied in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Some are Palestinian themselves. Many make specific demands against their schools, insisting in detail on divestment from arms companies that supply Israel, and transparency around school investments. If you're a student, you sure as hell don't want your tuition dollars going to Israeli air raids. This is not that complicated. Despite these often carefully laid protest goals, news media continually dismisses the efforts of these students, insisting they're just frivolous children that don't understand what they're out there arguing for, suggesting they have no real aims, that they're funded by secret Islamic dark money, organized by outside agitators, maybe that the white teenagers are literally Hamas.
It is crazy. You'll hear on CNN and be like, they're Hamas. And I'm like, what are you on about, dude? Like,
right. This bike chain that they bought from the campus store to chain the doors to the hall closed is like terrorists.
Yeah, that was supplied by Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Saddam Hussein.
Did you ever see the video of the one guy who was launching fireworks into the encampment at UCLA?
No, I didn't. Jesus, what?
Oh, that was wild. There was a counter protester. He was launching aerial fireworks, like into the encampment, which was probably not pleasant for the people in there. I don't think anyone got hurt, but
yeah, that would have been scary. Glad no one got hurt, I hope. Protesters get accused of violence, of illiberal methods, of doing great harm to students and teachers by like chanting and stuff. I don't know. The thing that you notice if you read about this stuff is it's really normal protest shit. In an analysis that ended on May 3rd, 97% of Palestinian solidarity protests were found to be peaceful. Shocker.
That sounds about right. Assuming we're not like including property damage, which we shouldn't, to be clear.
Which we shouldn't. Not the same. And, different, right? Scale. There are matters of degree here. Anyway.
I was rather, I don't know if I should say disappointed. I saw at PSU, which is in your backyard, that they, of all things, like messed up the library, which, no, I was a little disappointed in that, but that's okay.
But I mean, objects are objects,
Right, but like, why not the admin building was my question. Like, if you're gonna, if you want like to destroy something,
fuck up the School of Business, mess with the.
Oh yeah, Jesus Christ, man! Like, God knows they deserve it, even if they aren't supporting like genocidal.
Yeah, at any point you could just make business students' lives a living hell. I wouldn't care. All of this aside, camps were swept by city police in riot gear. Students were arrested for peaceful sit-ins. Cops grabbed protesters, including university professors, and threw them to the ground before beating them with fists and batons. Police stationed at least one sniper atop a building over a protest at Indiana University.
Oh, red state shit.
And everyone's been using tear gas. U.S. senators have insisted that the protests were violent, anti-Semitic, a threat to students, despite very little evidence. In a quote right out of Republic Chancellor Palpatine's speechwriting notebook, President Biden said, "Dissent is essential for democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder." Which, come on, man, read the fucking room. Biden is increasingly unhappy with Israel. In February of this year, he called Israel's actions over the top. At the end of May, Biden outlined a plan for an enduring ceasefire in Gaza. He's clearly not happy with Netanyahu. Obviously, the genocide looks terrible. It's bad for optics.
And I mean, like, I know people who have taken some time to come around on this thing because there is sort of a cultural bias in the United States towards supporting Israel for kind of historic reasons. And it could also kind of just be that the guy figured it out and is like, oh, well, crap. This looks bad. I'm maybe supporting something bad. We should probably stop this.
Right, but it's like, I don't care about what's in Joe Biden's heart. I mean, if I'm put on the review board for whether or not he gets into heaven, I might care, but I don't right now. The United States, and the Biden administration in particular, has enabled Israel to the point of calamity. And that's not something you can walk back. I hope there is a ceasefire. I hope the surviving Palestinians are given a chance at a free and equal life, in homes they no longer have to fear will have US-funded warheads dropped on them. But a lot of the damage is done.
What I'm curious about, just in a general sense, is why this time? Because this is not the first time this has happened. This happens like pretty regularly every 10 years. And I remember the last time like 25,000 people died.
2014.
I guess what I'm curious about is why this time it happened, this has become a social movement to stop it, as opposed to any of the previous times. That's sort of just a sociological question of mine. Like, is it just TikTok? It might just be TikTok. Like, I don't know. I'm curious.
Can I give you my guess that is anecdotal?
Please.
This didn't make it into the script, but I think one of the reasons why the Vietnam War protests expanded the way they did is because there was already a climate of social movement in the 60s. I'm sure I will end up linking an article about this in the sources, but there was decreased support for the Vietnam War among Black people in America in the 60s. And a lot of feminist groups and civil rights groups kind of glommed on to anti-Vietnam demonstration stuff and threw their weight behind it.
I mean, I can see that because I think the last big flare-up of the Israel-Palestine conflict was
It was 2014, wasn't it?
Was 2014, which is like still in the middle of the Obama era when everyone's, relatively speaking, fairly, if not happy, then acclimatized to the status quo.
Right. A lot of people are like, well, the US government, we tortured some folks, but there was a
whomst among us
degree of coming back around to the party line. Right?
And then we had Trump, and then we had COVID, and everything went to shit.
Right. And now people are kind of in this zone of not believing government narratives, being ready to say, hey, this is bad stuff. Student protesters right now were either graduating high school or in high school when big Black Lives Matter protests were popping up all over the country, all over the world. And on one hand, they are more acclimatized to large-scale protests because of that. On the other, they might be more aware of the fact that they might need some really specific goals for their movement, which a lot of them have, a lot of student organizations.
I have mentioned my criticism of certain protest movements with regards to this in the past to you in private conversation. But many of these kind of student protest movements have good, defined, and specific goals, which are what you need to actually have a protest do something. There are certainly other ones that have not been so well-disciplined, but on the whole, this is a very well-disciplined group, and they are getting fairly good results in terms of having universities stop investing in things that are contributing to this. So, no, it's been good.
Right. They're not going to convince Israel to stop. That's not the goal.
I think my favorite example is Northwestern University, who got like exactly what they wanted and problem solved for them. That's what they can do. But the point being, like, yeah, this is a pretty disciplined movement, which is good.
The climate of social awareness and the vibe around harmful government shit is very different than it was a decade ago, is different than it was 2 decades ago,
Another sort of pertinent question is, how long is this going to last? This one, right? Because the sort of social movement of the Vietnam era didn't last forever, right? It fizzled out. Then we had the 80s and 90s, which were relatively less activist-y, if you get my meaning.
And then there was 9/11.
And then there was 9/11.
And a lot of people hated that, but kind of the popular idea was America returned to a certain degree of jingoism, right?
Well, I mean, when you have something like that happen, it tends to...
yeah, I'm not saying it's like unforeseen. I'm just saying that's what happened.
Yeah, so we had like, what was it, 30-ish ish years of relatively lower level activism. Like, that's not to say nothing happened. Gay rights was big in the 90s. A lot happened there.
Thank God.
The Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, Jesus Christ, disability activism had its day in the 90s.
Yeah, literally the result of very hardworking activists.
But there wasn't what you might call an activist culture. And so I'm just wondering how long this one will last and what will happen before it ends. Because it will.
Yeah, the tune is going to change.
I mean, I can already sort of feel the tune changing a little bit. I can feel the momentum wearing off of the Trump era, of COVID, of Black Lives Matter.
Oh, certainly.
Because the kids don't care about it anymore. When I was in high school, at least, it was all everyone is talking about is Black Lives Matter, is how either pro or anti-Trump everyone was. And now the kids are...
You and I had very different high school experiences. God.
To be fair, you did graduate high school a fair bit earlier than I did.
Mm-hmm. I graduated high school in the 2010s. I don't know. The vibe was different. Kids cared less.
And that's not to say that there aren't kids who care now, but I think that the general vibe is that it's going to be like roughly from when you graduated to people who graduated a couple years behind me, who are kind of the most recent activist generation, I guess you could call it.
And the thing is a lot of the time, the things that wide social movements care about are things that matter. And the fact that people caring about them is like a product of their time does not mean they shouldn't care. The Vietnam War sucked total balls.
A lot of people died.
A lot of people died. A lot of civilians died. It was a waste of resources. It was a waste of money. And those students were right to be out there. So we're not discounting the work that activists have done.
No, of course not.
But these things come in waves. These things come as a result of certain social climates.
One more thing before you go. I was looking at this last night sort of out of curiosity because in my discussions with family members while I was at my parents' last week, people are really weird about this whole thing, especially the student protests. And I am just sort of curious how long it's going to take for people to come around to the view that they have of the Vietnam protests. Because most people now, even conservatives, view the Vietnam protests as sort of virtuous.
Or at least neutral.
So how long before that shift happens for this set of protests?
I mean, what is it going to be? Like, presumably, this conflict in Israel right now is not going to escalate to literal U.S. ground troop mobilization. I can't even imagine how that would happen politically, right?
Well, I can.
Okay, well, it does not seem likely from my perspective. I really hope this episode doesn't age poorly. So I assume that something else bad or distasteful or just kind of annoying is going to have to happen, because it's not about like how many atrocities happen before the US public care. No, it's like, how much is it a problem? I said this earlier. A huge part of the reason why middle America changed their tune on the Vietnam War was because veterans came home and had a fucking terrible time. So it wasn't just that the war itself was bad, it was that the aftermath of the war was bad, and that colored the war itself. The opposite happened with World War II. In closing, Star Wars is about the moral concerns that the Vietnam War raised. The abuse of executive power, the use of highly funded military might against the innocent, the necessity of opposition against the state you're in when it does atrocities in the name of its own sovereignty. I'm not saying Joe Biden, Joseph Robinette Biden, is literally Emperor Palpatine or whatever. I don't like the man. Joe Biden is a war criminal like every other president, but he's not literally Wizard Satan ruling a totalitarian regime. That's stupid and lacking nuance and not how any of this works. We exist within massive systems, some of them too big to even operate. The United States is a vast, inhuman machine. It dwarfs even its largest figurehead as an institution intent on its own supremacy, that values strength above all, and uses its military influence to exert its will across the world. And I think we have an answer now. Why do people say America is the empire?
Because sometimes it's believable.
Sometimes it just feels right.
Israel falls, Columbia pays! How many kids did you kill today?
Take a moment, take a breath, leave all the bad things behind. Sophie, you ready for some emails?
Oh, I love emails. Emails are my favorite.
Sophie, where can people email us?
Oh, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
This email is from Joel Davis. Joel says,
Hello again, Daughters of Ferrix. I wanted to write this email because I think it's something Star Wars could explore one day in greater detail. What exactly makes the New Republic new? I always find it funny the rebellion is the Alliance to Restore the Republic, but they call themselves the New Republic afterwards. What's so new about it? I would love one day for someone to write the in-universe constitutions of the Republic from the prequels and the New Republic and see if there are any differences. The closest example we have to this in the real world is France. France right now is in its 5th Republic. The 3rd and 4th Republics of France, as we know, were more parliamentary systems with a weak presidency and weak party systems, thus having a lot of ministers go in and out of office, barely lasting a year. While the 5th Republic was very much the pet project of one Charles de Gaulle, who essentially made the presidency a republican monarchy in all but name. So I would love to know, what are some of the finer details of what makes the New Republic new, such as do they have stricter rules for joining the Senate and an even weaker chancellor than before to ensure no emergency powers could be given? I know in Legends, the constitution of the New Republic changed a little bit to create a stronger executive after the New Republic fell to the clone Palpatine 5 years after the Battle of Endor in the Dark Empire comics, but that's about it. Sorry if the email is long and rambly, but long story short, would you like to see what's so new about the New Republic? Love the podcast as always. Joel Davis.
Thanks for your email, Joel. I know next to nothing about this topic, but I would like to mention that I do think that Emmanuel Macron is a Jupiterian man and that he will prevail.
Cool. I mean, obviously, Joel, you're just expressing a thing that you want to see. I also would like to see that. What I think makes the New Republic new is that it is a new legal structure. I think they adopted in some stuff from the Empire prior, but because the Empire was still running when the rebellion transitioned into the New Republic, they kind of just had to go, I don't know, and make a new thing. Like, if they had been able to, I guess, take over the Empire, it might have made more sense not to be the New Republic. But I don't know, you can, but they weren't going to be the Republic while they're fighting the Empire. That would be weird. That might send the wrong message. So I don't know. I think that's a big part of it. There was a really good Twitter thread that I read the other day where the author highlights that the Jedi Order may not have been dissolved as a political institution, as like a legal institution, and that therefore Darth Vader potentially would have had the same sort of military standing during the period between Episode 3 and Episode 4 as he would have as a Jedi. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's kind of similar where it's like sometimes you dissolve a legal entity, sometimes you don't. The Empire was dissolved, right? There was this actual surrender signed by Mas Amedda on Coruscant. Was it on Coruscant or was it on Chandrila? I think it was on Coruscant. Anyway, and I do expect that major differences we know about the New Republic were probably included in the New Republic Constitution. Stuff like the rolling capital, stuff like the amnesty program. And yeah, definitely they probably started the Supreme Chancellorship from scratch. They probably didn't walk back the stuff that Palpatine had changed to it, because I'm sure 30 years of Palpatine as your Supreme Chancellor, the legal powers of the Supreme Chancellor are probably pretty fucking different. So you probably just axe that whole part if you're copying and pasting the rest of it. I think the core of it they built from scratch, and then they grafted on a lot of Imperial stuff after the war, and that's probably when a lot of the worst of the rot set in. Our next email is from June. June says, "Hi, daughters. June again here. And this time I come to you with what might be a bit of a meta question. So for a little background, I'm a relatively new fan of Star Wars in the grand scheme of things. I'd watched the original trilogy and the prequels as a young kid, but they never grabbed me at all back then for whatever reason, and I remembered very little of the movies, absorbing most of my Star Wars knowledge via cultural osmosis for a long time. So after many years, and after casually watching The Force Awakens and then The Last Jedi in theaters and enjoying it, I watched The Mandalorian, and that's what awoke my curiosity and made me delve deeper into Star Wars. In retrospect, however, after enjoying more Star Wars media and learning more about the setting, I began to watch videos specifically critiquing the sequels, and found the critiques levied at those movies compelling at the time. Now I've become fully aware that some of these people I watched back then were bad faith alt-right types, trying to be inflammatory and disparaging to garner attention and clicks. However, there are other people nowadays that I still enjoy and are not problematic little freaks that still do seem to feel very negatively about the sequels, and I'm still somewhat torn on how I feel about Episode 7 and 8. I've no qualms, however, with my distaste for Episode 9, but that's hardly a hot take. So my question is,
When it comes to critique of a media franchise as expansive and far-reaching as Star Wars, how do you go about parsing valid criticism or simply a difference in personal preference, in contrast with inflammatory lambasting coming from people that are simply capitalizing on the popularity of a franchise like this to further a political agenda and or for their capital gain? And from my understanding of listening to your podcast, you seem like fans of the sequels, or at least parts of them. So I'd also love to hear more about how you personally feel about the trilogy as a whole. Once again, thank you for all you do and your wonderful answers. Love the answer to my last question about our problematic king, Luthen, as well. Love you gals parasocially, and may the cunt be with you always. Sophie?
Okay, here's the thing. I like one of the sequels very well. I like one of them okay, and I don't like one of them. The one that I don't like, to be clear, is The Force Awakens.
Really? Right. I remember this.
Yeah, that is not the one I care for. So, I don't know, what sort of helped for me, because I think that the way that these creators you're talking about have absorbed a dislike for the sequels is also sort of through cultural osmosis, as you mentioned. Cultural osmosis works just as well in kind of a subculture as it does in broader culture, and so when, a sizable minority, let's say, or maybe even a sizable majority of people in a subculture that you belong to dislike something, if you don't have like specific positive opinions about that thing for a different reason, you're likely to sort of absorb that negative energy.
Or even if you do, right?
Right.
This is something that you can see from certain YouTubers and certain like internet media opinion havers, where people came out of like The Last Jedi going, that was a pretty good movie. And then the like firestorm was that it was terrible. And they switched their tune within, a month or so. That was pretty common.
And I mean, another thing that helps me sort of get beyond my dislike for one of the sequels is understanding Star Wars as not necessarily as much of a franchise as it is kind of an art form. Star Wars is a medium for telling stories, and sometimes people are going to tell stories that you don't like, but it's still good Star Wars. I can definitely appreciate in The Force Awakens that there are some cool visuals. It's still kind of a fun movie, even if I don't like it. So, I don't know, find things to appreciate about the movies that you don't like, and you will eventually admit that The Last Jedi is the best Star Wars made since the original trilogy. Oh, and also that, I don't know, what is the last one? What's it called?
The Rise of Skywalker?
Yeah, that's a good movie, and it's fun even though it's stupid.
Yeah, it is fun even though it's stupid. That is largely my take on Episode 9 as well.
They ride freaking horses in a cavalry charge across a Star Destroyer. What is not to like about that?
Episode 9 is a lot of fun. The thing about Star Wars is that the people who are in it, the people who are so invested in Star Wars, and this has been proven for 3+ decades, cannot be normal about Star Wars. We cannot be trusted to be normal about Star Wars. It is perfectly reasonable to dislike a movie. It is perfectly reasonable to read a book and not like the book.
But we imbue our dislike of these things with an almost moral significance because of how important Star Wars is to culture.
Star Wars fans go insane when they don't like Star Wars. And I think it is responsible as a Star Wars fan to separate yourself from your dislike of a Star Wars if you want to be talking about Star Wars as a whole. If you want to just talk about a specific movie, you can be like, well, yeah, I don't like this other movie. That doesn't matter. But if we are talking about Star Wars as a series, I prefer to think of it as a series rather than a franchise. I don't like to think of things within purely corporate terms. I will not let the company tell me how I can enjoy Star Wars. I know I give them all my money. Shut up. I do tend to see Star Wars as something of like a text that you interpret. Because what we do a lot on this show is we do like loose, like literary analysis on Star Wars. And when you're doing literary analysis, it doesn't matter if you like the text. I mean, it matters a little bit. It might affect how you look at it. It might be fun to talk about, kind of as a framing device. But I don't care whether or not I like it. I care about what it says. I care about what it doesn't say. I care about the ways it's weird and the ways it's complicated. And that's how I like to engage with Star Wars. I read a lot of Star Wars. I read books and comics and I play games and I do all of this bullshit. And usually my takeaway is that I thought that a book was okay. I thought that a show was pretty good. I thought that this thing had a lot of visuals that I enjoyed, or some ideas that I liked, or a character that I thought was really cool. But I don't know. Most Star Wars does not blow me away. Most Star Wars films do not blow me away. I have had deep experiences with multiple Star Wars movies, but other ones I have had to develop my relationship with them. And I mean develop my relationship with them. I firmly believe that Star Wars becomes Star Wars on the rewatch. And that is because what we think of as monolithically Star Wars, I don't know if that's a word, as monolithic Star Wars, is that because it is the thing that was Star Wars when we got into Star Wars, or when we were first excited about Star Wars, or looking back on Star Wars, when we replayed the original trilogy tapes over and over and over and over again in our parents' basement, or whatever.
Because it's just a movie until you watch it again, and then it becomes Star Wars. That's good. I like that.
And when we are talking about it as just a movie, that is when I will tell you that I didn't really like episode 9 when it came out. And by didn't really like episode 9 when it came out, I mean I was depressed for weeks, because episode 7 showed me that I actually really cared about Star Wars, even though I didn't really realize it at the time. And episode 8 was the best thing since sliced bread. And episode 9 let me down. Episode 9 was after I was really in it. I was reading books. I was reading the tie-in comics, the Journey to the Rise of Skywalker. And episode 9 let me down. I kind of avoided thinking about it for a few months. And then I watched it and I went, this is okay. It's kind of dumb. And then I started thinking about it and I was like, I don't like that thing. I don't like this thing about it. And that was hard for me. And since then, I've gotten over it. Part of the reason I've gotten over it is because I like talking about Star Wars. I like Star Wars as a whole. I did not like the prequels as a child. I think I enjoyed The Phantom Menace to a degree, but to me, they didn't have that thing that, for whatever reason, I actually really liked about Star Wars. To me, Star Wars was the original trilogy. Now I love the prequels. I think they're fun. The Phantom Menace is bullshit. Episode 2 was my least favorite Star Wars film. Now my least favorite Star Wars film is Episode 9. And you know what? Episode 9 has Babu Frick and Wheel Droid and that fuck-ass Death Star carcass and Ben Solo. Ben Solo may not get lines, but he's fucking great in that movie. It's not a bad movie. Star Wars has never made a bad movie. Star Wars has never made a bad-looking movie. And even the weakest entries, or the entries that I see as weakest, have a lot to offer. It's not just on the rewatch, but on the reconsider. Star Wars Brotherhood is a book that came out in 2022 by author Mike Chen. It is set very close after Episode 2. And you know what? It recontextualizes a lot of stuff that I do not like about Episode 2. And it makes it a lot more palatable. And listen, I don't watch Episode 2 and go, oh, this thing is explained in this book, so I feel... No, that's not what I feel. Reading the books lets me work through some of those feelings. Lets me go, oh yeah, there is a different way of seeing it. You know what got me to love Episode 9? Listening to people who love Episode 9. Fans of Episode 9 have such interesting reads of that movie, its thematic decisions, and Palpatine's role in it, and Rey's role in it, and all of this stuff. And yeah, there's stuff that I find uneven and that I feel doesn't land for me, but that stuff is as much in the text as the things that I get on analysis of Episode 8, which is to say, it's both in the text and not in the text. We're bringing our own interpretations to it. Everything's fair game. And people going, hey, this movie is worth caring about, when I didn't know how to care about it. And now I do. I'm fine with Episode 9. Part of the reason I'm fine with Episode 9 is that that's not the end of the story. One of the things that really bothered me was I didn't feel resolved. And I knew it was going to be a really long time before I got to see Rey again. I really like Rey. Rey's important to me as a character. And she's going to be in a movie. Star Wars doesn't end. That makes it easier too, is just knowing that if I don't like the ending, I tend not to like the endings of Star Wars stories. And I can often live with that because there will usually be another or a thing that resolves that later, or just some fuck-ass author in 15 years who also felt unresolved about that and writes a comic about it. I don't trust Star Wars the brand, but I trust the people who write Star Wars that they care about Star Wars, even if they care about it differently from me, even if I don't like what they did. And sort of treating it as this larger than life thing, because none of us can be normal about Star Wars. I know it's silly. I know it's almost treating Star Wars as a quasi-religious text, but it allows me to be a lot more normal about it, because I don't think I could if I didn't separate myself from it in that way. I think I care too much. I think Star Wars is too important to me to be normal about it without treating it as something outside of the text itself, I guess. Star Wars is a miasma. Star Wars is not individual films that I like or dislike. Thank you for your question, June. That is a really good one. I hope our responses were satisfying.
Unlike the ending of episode 9, according to Ellie.
It did not satisfy me. It still kind of doesn't satisfy me. It bums me the hell out that Ben Solo died, but I don't know.
Good riddance. He was a whiny bitch.
I've made peace with it.
That's my actual opinion, by the way. I was not joking.
I think Kylo Ren is a really cool and engaging character, and I think he is a more interesting view of a person embroiled in a fascist system than Darth Vader is. Get fucked, Darth Vader. Okay.
This is true.
If you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, you can send them to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
If you want to listen to new episodes as they release every other Wednesday, you can find us on most places you can listen to podcasts. You can find sources for this episode on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, FerrixPod.
Thank you to our comrades Joel Miranda and Emrys Nereus for making this episode possible. If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/daughtersofferrix. I have been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. Sophia, what about you?
So you can find me at Sophia in SLC on Twitter. You can find me at @theredline_pod on Twitter, where we talk about trains. You can also find me at Episcopiled, where we talk about religion.
Oh boy.
That's all.
This episode was written and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller, and co-written by Sophia Dunstan. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening.
And watch episode 9.
Yeah, you know what? It's good. Say hi to Babu Frick for me.